Hey, it's Minute Book Report. In this video, I wanted to talk about The Miserable Mill, which is the fourth book in the series of Unfortunate Events series. And I want to talk about the book, and I want to talk about the Netflix series, but I really want to talk about the series in the context of the book, and always keeping the book in mind as the foundation, as the original base source. But I really enjoyed the Netflix series, and I'm very, very much interested to see what they do in the future. But first, the book. This is a pretty basic story where the kids are sort of put into this lumber mill where they're forced to work, and it's really bad conditions. And then Klaus's glasses break, so he has to go and get them repaired from the local optometrist. And he comes back and he's kind of zombie-like, and they can't really figure out what's wrong with him. And then he turns normal, but then he's not normal because he has to go back and get his glasses fixed. And that's where they meet Count Olaf as the receptionist. Things look pretty bad for the kids, but they manage to sort of figure out what the plan is, and Klaus becomes unhypnotized, and Count Olaf and his accomplice, they run away. What I really liked about this book was that it felt like for a long time the kids never had to deal with Count Olaf. I know in the Netflix show, which I'll talk later, the kids had to deal with Count Olaf quite early, and he kind of revealed where he was involved in the story. There's a pretty strong connection between Count Olaf and Dr. Orwell, but in the book, there's no real tight connection. It's never really quite explained. So in the book, I really like the fact that these kids were basically dropped in this camp, and the deal was that they would be protected in the lumber mill, but the conditions were very bad. And what I liked about this was that the struggle was finally not against Count Olaf directly, because a lot of the other stories, we meet Count Olaf early and the kids can't get rid of him, and no one believes them that's actually who it is. In this story, their actual main conflict is really environmental. It's against a lot of things that were happening around them and the working conditions and how bad they are. And I really like that in this story because it sort of changes that sort of cartoony sort of storyline where we kind of figure what's going to happen. They get set into a challenge, they defeat the bad guy, and then they move on. Here, it looks like they're safe from their sort of main opposition, but then in fact, the environment around them is draining the life out of them. Their time in the lumber mill reminded me of when I had one of my first jobs. And out of college, I thought that I was going to get a very cushy desk job where I had no physical labor. But in fact, one of the first jobs I had was I was working at a golf course. And what I had to do was I had to clean up the golf balls on the driving range, and it was a very physical intensive job, and it was something that I was totally not used to. I complained a lot in my mind, and it was just such a bad job, and I could relate to these kids as they're having to work in this lumber mill, especially when they had to debark the trees. That seemed to be terrible, and these kids are so tired and so exhausted, and it's something that although they're children and they shouldn't be working in a lumber mill, there were some parts of the book where I read where, in fact, it sounded like these kids were almost like spoiled, like they had never worked a day in their life. And so here, we're gonna throw you into this working world, and in a way, I kind of like that. I don't support child labor and things like that, but I just really appreciate the fact that these kids were given some real world working experience. Granted, they're super young and their parents had just died, but I kind of looked at that and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting that they would be forced to actually have to work, to actually have to struggle. And I know up to that point, their life, since their parents died, was quite a big struggle. But it was just sort of nice to see where their struggle, and it was very real world struggles where they had to work and they were basically in this working class. I think the best lesson out of this book is that children can be more than what they just specialize in. That wasn't really something that was in the Netflix show. It's more so in the book, because we see two characters who have to kind of figure out what the other character does. So what I mean by that is there's a couple of scenes in the book where Violet has to figure out how to read a certain book because she has to read this book on hypnosis and she doesn't understand it. So she has to take her time, and usually that's Klaus's specialty where he'll read something and understand it. But for Violet, she's very like mechanical, she likes to invent things. and she just can't. She doesn't know how to understand that text, and so she has to sort of rely on herself. She can't rely on Klaus anymore to figure that out, and I thought that was really good character growth in the book. Likewise, Klaus had to do a very similar thing where he's not really the inventive one, but in the book he has to figure out how to stop the saw machine. And it was because of his sort of thinking where he thought, okay, what would Violet do? What would Violet do? And he figures out this weird mechanical, I don't know, some kind of hook or something. In the book, they explain it, but he figures out how to shut down the machine, and he's able to invent on the fly. And I just thought that for those two characters, it was really good. And the lesson there is that for kids and for really anyone, you don't always have to work within your stereotype, all your strengths. I think in school we often sort of split everyone in two groups. You're either good at math or you're good at writing, and it's like you can't be good at both. It's mutually exclusive, to where yes, you're good at math, but oh yeah, I just don't do writing. I can't really read, or I love writing, but I just can't do math. Like, we see that dynamic a lot in schools, but in this story we see two characters who have very different minds, but they're able to sort of cross the road into each other's strengths, and when the time comes, they have to figure things out on their own. So let's get to the Netflix series and just some of my comments as I was watching it. So this is episode 7, which is the first part. And my first note was, the parents burned down the town? What? And that was very surprising that they would claim that the parents burned down the town, because in the book that was not even a thing. There was no relation to Poultryville and the Baudelaires. It was just the town that was nearby. And in the show, they made like this very sort of strong connection between the Baudelaire name and all the workers, or whatever happened in that city. And I just was scratching my head like, wait, what? That's kind of a strange connection to have. I mentioned this earlier, but Count Olaf appears very early in this story in terms of the Netflix series. He's like one of the first characters introduced here, and it changes the dynamic of how the story is told. In the book, we don't meet Count Olaf until way, way into the book. And there's, again, that sense of children versus their environment at the lumber mill. But early on, we know that Count Olaf is working with Dr. Orwell, and that they have this scheme that they're going to come up with. And it changes the sort of direction of the story. It changes what the opposition is and the major conflict in this story. I felt like that pulled away from the children and their environment at Lucky Mills. I wish that they would have focused more on that struggle rather than sort of them struggling, but there's this huge external force, the villains working together to try and get them. In the book, it was very subtle. We didn't know what was going on in the background until, of course, Shirley, the character, is introduced. So in this show, I guess it was kind of fun and interesting, but it definitely sort of, I think it took attention away from what I felt was the major conflict in this story. One of the things that this Netflix series has done is it sort of fills in a lot of the holes, and by that it creates motivation for certain characters. In the book, I never really understood what Dr. Orwell was doing, why Dr. Orwell wanted to sort of hypnotize Klaus, other than the fact that Dr. Orwell was working with Count Olaf. I never really got that connection. But in a Netflix series, they kind of explain why she holds this grudge against the entire family, and I thought that was really good. I wish they would have explained that a little bit more, because it seems to be just on the surface, but we don't quite get enough of that. I also like how they explain why the workers are there. When they had that part in the book where the workers were talking about they worked for coupons, but they never had any money, I wondered, why don't they just leave? And in the book, I believe they don't give a reason. They just stay there, and I guess they're just kind of slow-minded. They just can't think. But in the Netflix series, they give a reason that, yeah, they're all hypnotized, and that's the reason why they stay. And Dr. Orwell and Sir are actually working together on this whole sort of scheme, this whole sort of project. And it was just kind of an interesting twist on that, that fact to fill in those gaps. And of course, at the end of the episode, I wrote, "Twist of the parents." That was a big twist, and that got me. I thought that they were actually going to open the doors, and the way that scene was shot, where they're opening the yellow doors and the children are waiting for them and they're hoping to see their parents, and we realize that was not their parents. That was definitely a curveball. I thought, wow, that was very clever. That definitely got me. That was one of those moments where I felt like that's what makes television so good. That's what makes like these types of Netflix series where you're gonna binge watch them over and over again. That was an excellent hook, because for a while I was thinking I don't want to see the parents because the parents are dead, and they refer to them in the end credits as mother and father, and so I assumed that it was the Baudelaire, parents, but actually it's the Quagmire parents, which, if you know from the next story, it's gonna be the parents of the kids who befriend the Baudelaires, which is really excellent. Although I thought in the book the parents had died earlier. It seems like it was almost in real time, but I guess we'll see how they handle that. So moving on to the last episode, episode 8, which is part 2. I wrote down conflict between Violet and Klaus, stay or leave, help the workers or not. I felt like in this interpretation, the Netflix series, they sort of was building up to this kind of mini conflict between Violet and Klaus, where they had different objectives. In the book, I don't think they've ever sort of confronted each other, like, we should leave, or no, we should stay and help them and figure out what's going on. In the show, there was kind of this weird tension between them at moments where they wanted to go, but Violet wanted to stick around, and then Klaus wanted to run away, and then sort of at the end they kind of switched and they ended up never leaving. So I thought that was kind of a little interesting thing, because the entire time in this series so far, they've always been on the same team, and in the books I've always viewed them as one unit, always working together. But it's interesting to introduce some conflict amongst them and kind of see how they handle that. I did note that there's a difference in how Dr. Orwell dies from the book to the Netflix series, where she dies in the book from a saw, and in the Netflix show she dies from the furnace, which I thought was kind of interesting. I was kind of wondering how they were gonna show that, because I guess that's pretty gruesome, but I guess they handled it pretty well. And the last thing I want to mention is the fire of the Quagmire's house. And, it is kind of sad, because we've gotten to know those two individuals, the parents, throughout this series, because we thought that they were the Baudelaire parents. And it was kind of sad knowing that they didn't make it. And it's interesting that in this series, they took two characters that in the books really were nothing. And they were really no one. They had no identity, but they made us care about these two characters, and I really like that. Although it is misleading, I think it adds more drama. It adds more hook, and it really does, I think, strengthen when the Quagmires come in, because we got to know their parents sort of throughout this story, throughout season 1. That now when season 2 starts and they start at the academy, or they start at the school, we understand who the Quagmires are, because in that book it was kind of like, whoa, what's happening? Who are these kids? They just seem to pop out of nowhere. But now we know that they have so much in common with the Baudelaire kids that it's kind of nice that they can sort of come together, which will then lead to, spoiler alert, when they sort of what happens at the end of the next book, makes that relationship between the two families, the two siblings, that much stronger. So I think that was very, very clever, very nice, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens next in the series. So those are my thoughts on both the book and the Netflix series. Again, I felt like this was one of the strongest 2-part series episodes of the Netflix show, and obviously they made it very strong because they want people to watch the next season. Very understandable. In terms of the book, it wasn't necessarily the strongest book, but I felt like it introduced a lot of really good ideas for kids to sort of emulate, and it was just nice, again, to sort of take them to a different space where, again, we worked with a lake, we worked with sort of this dark house, and now we move to this like middle of nowhere lumber mill in sort of far in the valley, and it's just nice to see these different settings, and I'm looking forward to sort of following these kids along now. Although some people may say the story is formulaic, where the kids appear somewhere, Count Olaf comes, he's in disguise, he gets defeated, and the kids move to the next adult. I'm finding that the Netflix series is really kind of opening up some doors in terms of, some characters that I never would have thought of in that way, and I think that's what a good adaptation does. So thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.